During the 6 long years of World War II, behind the fighting forces, there was another war, a secret war, fought by scientists and engineers. German scientists had been deeply involved in the rearmament of their country since the mid-1930s, and they had without doubt placed Germany ahead of all other countries in the development of advanced weapons. But it was a challenge that British scientists were well placed to meet, due in no small measure to a far-sighted decision taken in 1938 to compile a register of some 5,000 scientists who would be available in the event of war.
Throughout the war, at every stage, we were far quicker in marrying the expanding technology that was coming along and the needs of the war, far quicker and more original and spontaneous than the Germans were.
In the beginning of the war, our fighter planes had a better speed than yours. Our radar system worked already. We had those Würzburg Geräte, and also we were starting already with a V2 development. But this was the advantage of us only because we started much earlier.
May 1940, and the Luftwaffe begins sending night bombers to fly over the blacked-out towns and countryside of Britain. Not the massed formations that people have been fearing, but lone aircraft, mainly Junkers 88s and Heinkel 111s, and often flying at great height. They're plotted by our early radar, and it is at first thought that they're merely probing our night defences. But later it's realised that these nocturnal wanderers have a far more sinister purpose. The German aircrew are proving early forms of what will later become known as electronic warfare, in this case a system of highly secret radio beams that will enable enemy bombers to locate vital targets anywhere in Britain, even on the darkest of nights. The German codename for the first of these beams is Knickerbein, the crooked leg. September 1938, and the transport squadrons of the German Luftwaffe, which has only been in official existence for 3 years, take part in Operation Green, the occupation of Czechoslovakia. This new, efficient air force has been tested in Spain, and now consists of 3,300 operational aircraft. If war had come in 1938, the RAF would have had to meet this formidable force with just 500 biplane fighters. Only 90 Hurricanes, only 1 squadron of Spitfires were in operational service. The question was, could we possibly catch up? The Second World War begins on the 1st of September 1939 with the attack on Poland. The Me-109 fighters of the German Air Force find the obsolete Polish aircraft easy meat. The Poles are hopelessly outclassed. In just 2 days, their air force simply ceases to exist, most of its aircraft being destroyed on the ground. Without modern fighter opposition, the cities and towns are defenseless, and the Stuka dive bombers blast a path for the armies below. The Germans have added sirens to the Stukas, called Jericho trumpets, to enhance the terror aspect of this new form of warfare. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, and lightning it proves to be. Poland is smashed in just 28 days. Norway, Denmark and the Low Countries soon follow. And in England, people begin to wonder when the might of the German Air Force will be used against them. The threat is real enough and is made the more ominous by Hitler's boast of new secret weapons, against which he claims we will be defenceless. Confirmation of these unspecified weapons comes from a most unexpected source, Germany, or at least from a German. In November 1939, the British naval attaché in Oslo receives an anonymous letter, which must rate as one of the most incredible windfalls in the history of espionage. The Oslo Report, as it becomes known, lands on the desk of Dr. R.V. Jones of Air Ministry Scientific Intelligence.
And the letter purported to come from somebody who wished us well, who, if one could believe it, knew a great deal about German research developments. And he said there were a number of things going on. He told us about the Ju-88 being used as a night fighter, as a dive bomber, for example. He mentioned Peenemünde. He also mentioned that they were developing large rockets, although he didn't actually say they were being done at Peenemünde. And it was the first mention we'd had of Peenemünde. He also told us about the development of pilotless aircraft that was going on, two kinds of German radar, one of which he said had been used against us in the raids where we'd suffered heavy losses on Wilhelmshaven and Kiel. And most important for this particular story was the idea, what he called Fliegerentfernungsmessgerät, a device for measuring the distance of an aircraft, for example, for bombing. Didn't talk about platform beams at all, but did mention this method of ranging whereby one sent out a modulated wave from a ground station up to the aircraft, relayed it back from the aircraft to the ground, and the delay in the transit time, the pilot could be told from the ground how far away he was.
Our own early warning radar could tell us how far away enemy bombers were, but it was not at that time much use against night intruders. However, an RAF night fighter, directed by ground radar onto the track of a solitary Heinkel 111, made a lucky visual contact and the enemy aircraft was shot down. The crashed aircraft was examined as a matter of routine by RAF technical officers. They salvaged a scrap of paper which seemed to be a sort of aid memoir for the navigator. And it read, in translation of course, navigation aid, radio beacons working on plan A. Additionally, from 0600 hours, beacon Dernen. Light beacon after dark, radio beacon Nickerbine from 0600 hours on 315 degrees. While the intelligence officers were working out what that meant, another Heinkel 111 from the same squadron, KG-26, crashed a few nights later. It bore the same identification marks, 1HAC, and seemed to be a replacement aircraft for the earlier loss. It too carried compromising literature, a personal diary from one of the aircrew which bore an entry for the 5th of March 1940. It read, 2/3 of the staffel or squadron are on leave. In the afternoon, studied Nickerbine and collapsible boats. Well, collapsible boats are clear enough, but there was that strange word Nickerbine occurring again. What could it possibly mean? Because Nickerbine happens to be the name for a magic raven in a German fairy story, although the literal translation is simply a crooked leg. One of the obvious ways of finding out more about Nickerbine was obviously through the careful interrogation of German aircrew who had parachuted from their planes over Britain. And during one such session at the Trent Hall Interrogation Centre, the pilot clearly hedged when Nickerbine was mentioned. The interrogator picked up the point, and eventually the pilot revealed that Nickerbine was something like excorate. Clearly he believed we already knew everything about excorate, which we didn't. And he went on to say that they were shortwave radio beams aimed from Germany over Britain. So the trail had suddenly come alive, and the knowledge from these interrogations, together with information from other sources, made it clear that excorate and Nickerbine were radio navigation aids for attacking bombers. And about this time, R.V. Jones thought that the evidence, though tenuous, was sufficient for a report to the Chiefs of Staff, which he called indications of new German weapons against Britain. June the 3rd, 1940, and the last of the British troops have been evacuated from Dunkirk. The remainder are captured, and this unique film records the desperate measures being prepared on the south coast beaches to meet the expected German invasion. and the real Dad's army prepared to defend their country. Across the Channel, the Luftwaffe, now using French airfields, prepared to take part in Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. Their orders are transmitted from headquarters to the forward airfields by radio. They're sent in the supposedly unbreakable Enigma code. One of these signals is intercepted, and the 5-letter groups, when deciphered, provide a most significant message.
What it said, I'll translate her, it said Knickerbein, and then there came the word Klever, is established or confirmed, the German's ambiguous at this point, at point 5324 north, 1 degree west. Now, 5324 north, 1 degree west is in England. It is a point roughly on the Great North Road, about a mile south of Retford. Knickerbein, we knew already as the name which we suspected of being concerned with a beach, right on the very western edge of Germany. In fact, if I can just bring the map in, we have it here.
Dr. Jones took the message to Professor Lindemann, his old tutor and now scientific advisor to Winston Churchill, and tried to persuade him of the serious threat posed by the Knickerbein beams. But Lindemann was not convinced, pointing out that at the high frequencies necessary for an accurate beam, the curvature of the Earth would prevent its being directed against targets in Britain.
This is an argument which fortunately I had met before when I myself had been putting up a system rather like this for, as a proposal for our own bomber navigation, and it had been turned down on this very ground. And fortunately, from the point of view of this story anyway, I had seen a paper by Mr. T.L. Eckersley of the Marconi Company, who was the sort of confidential consultant to our radio listening service, when he had worked out what you could receive on the ground from transmitters at various points. And he'd actually taken a transmitter over on the Brocken, over in central Germany, and he had shown that it was in principle possible to receive it by a receiver somewhere even in Britain. And so I got out Eckersley's report as a piece of ammunition to go back to Lindemann the next day. But in that 24 hours, a great deal more happened.
The Trent Park Centre had received more captured aircrew. The interrogator, Squadron Leader Falkin, had asked about Knickerbein, but the crews had given nothing away.
Nothing puzzling, nothing in any way unusual. All the radio sets were exactly what you'd expect to find in a night bomber.
As this captured wartime film shows, the standard German airborne radio equipment at that time, 1939 to 1940, was the FUG-10, which comprised excellent transmitters and receivers for long and shortwave communication. The aircraft were also equipped with direction-finding receivers, as well as the only device which R.V. Jones considered could, by any stretch of the imagination, be capable of detecting a beam: the Lorenz blind landing receivers, the EBL-1 and the EBL-2. Radio expert, Squadron Leader Cox Walker.
So I asked Cox Walker if there was anything odd about the blind landing receiver. And effectively, the prisoner had thought we wouldn't spot it because it looked to be an ordinary blind landing receiver. But in fact, it was a much better receiver than one needed. It would have the necessary sensitivity, we thought. And so here was the answer.
Now, the RAF knew all about Lorenz. There was a blind approach development unit at Boscombe Down, which had actually published a handbook, AP 1751 Blind Approach Pilot's Handbook, which described the details of the technique. And there was certainly nothing secret about it. It had been in use in several commercial and military aircraft in various parts of the world since 1937. Its main purpose was to enable pilots to locate and make a blind approach to an airfield in conditions of bad visibility and even at night. So how did it work? Well, the principle was pretty straightforward, although to use it required very accurate flying on the part of the pilot. Basically, there was a radio beacon at the end of the runway firing a coded signal straight down the centre line of the runway. And an aircraft tuned into the appropriate frequency could pick that signal up 15, 20 miles away. When he was flying towards the runway on the left-hand side of the beam, the pilot would hear simply a series of dots. As he turned towards the centre line, the dots and dashes would come together to make a single constant note known as an equi-signal. As he flew out to the right-hand side of the beam, the signal would become simply a series of dashes. So, by listening to the signal, the pilot would know whether he was to the left of the runway, lined up with it, or out to the right-hand side. As he flew closer to the runway, the beam became narrower, so hopefully he could fly more accurately and actually carry out a landing. The important thing to bear in mind is the range. For all the known uses at that time, the range was only 15 to 20 miles.
Nevertheless, Dr. Jones was convinced that his theory was correct, that the German bombers were using their Lorenz blind landing sets to fly the long-range beams. And if this was so, then the threat was very grave indeed, because all German bombers carried this equipment as standard. Therefore, all of them were potential beam flyers. He decided that he would have to convince Lindemann.
Convinced him on the theory, now, with Eckers's paper, that the beams would bend round sufficiently, that it was in the blind landing receiver. Therefore, they must be on frequencies to which the blind landing receivers could be set, and therefore we could listen for them. And Lindemann changed completely at that point and wrote a minute to Churchill, warning him that they seemed to have some new system which would enable them, the German Air Force, to bomb us fairly accurately at night.
It was now June the 14th, and as the victorious German army marched into Paris, it was clear that it could only be a matter of days before the French would sue for peace. It meant that the German Air Force would have new, nearer bases for their bombers and their transmitters. It made the beams an even graver threat. But we were yet to be defeated. Our radar was still watching round the clock, and our night fighters managed to make some interceptions.
We had been far luckier than, in retrospect, we ought to be in shooting down German aircraft. And over that few days, there were several prisoners who came in. Of course, they were all interrogated as skillfully. And by that, I don't mean tortured or anything like that. They were just, it was a battle of wits, in which Felkin was really very, very good. The result was that quite a lot of information came out. And, of course, documents, too, in the captured aircraft, including, I suppose from around the 19th or 20th of June, one which actually the navigator torn up the bits. I think Felkin told me that there were 3,000 pieces they had actually picked up, and they sat up all night sticking them together. And these, when the bits were stuck together, actually gave, and I think I have them here, the mention of the figures, and it said UKW, which means ultra-Kurzwelle and ultra-shortwave, and Knicki, which is obviously Knickebein, and they then gave a position, 53.38.7 north, 8 degrees, 56.8 minutes west.
Stolberg. This was the location of a second Knickebein transmitter in Schleswig-Holstein. This station provided the crossbeam for the one at Cleve. The bomber pilot could use the Cleve beam for direction, flying along its equisignal. Then, when near the target, the receiver would be tuned to the crossbeam from Stolberg to give the range. First, he would fly through the dots to reach the constant tone of the equisignal, and when he was in the centre of the crossbeam, the target would be directly beneath the bomber. The massive aerials of the Knickebein station could be swung to locate the beams over any target. The captured documents even gave the frequencies in use, 30 and 31.5 megacycles. This information was available to R.V. Jones just in time for a meeting with the Prime Minister.
I said to him, well, so would it help if I told you the story from the beginning? Well, he sort of startled back a bit and said, yes, that's a good idea. I said, and, of course, I then told him the story right from the beginning of how the build-up had occurred with the stories of the ex-great being mentioned by prisoners, and building up, of course, to all the very latest evidence. And then the discussion, of course, obviously Winston was convinced. I could see I was making an impression, obviously a very deep impression. And at the end of it, well, what could be done? And, well, various countermeasures could be undertaken, putting in a false beam, the first one I'd thought of, or fooling about with the dots and the dashes, or even straight jamming. There were various possibilities.
Winston Churchill's version of that same meeting is contained in his book, Their Finest Hour. And he writes, being master and not having to argue too much, once I was convinced about the principles of this queer and deadly game, I gave all the necessary orders that very day in June for the existence of the beams to be assumed and for all countermeasures to receive absolute priority.
The slightest reluctance or deviation in carrying out this policy was to be reported to me.
But of course the first thing was to be absolutely certain that they really were there and it wasn't a great hoax. I didn't think it was for a moment, but nevertheless one needed to really listen. And by this time we had in fact got a search aircraft equipped.
It was an Avro Anson from the Blind Flying Unit at Boscombe Down. As it was being prepared, the French were selling the armistice in Fox railway carriage at Compiègne. While Hitler was conducting this humiliating piece of theatre, in London there was a parallel meeting which was to prove in its way just as dramatic. The radio expert, T.L. Eckersley, on whose evidence Jones was relying, was about to drop a bombshell. Arnold Wilkins, from the National Physical Laboratory, was present when Eckersley spoke.
And I remember him saying that, in his opinion, reception at any distance on this wavelength was quite impossible, and he'd stake his reputation on this statement.
Well, this was an absolute blow from my point of view, because if that really were true, of course, all the fuss that I had been the cause of would now be exploded. And what could happen to me for the rest of my life, I don't know, was very problematic. But I pointed out to him that I'd used one of his own papers to convince Lindemann that this showed quite clearly the beams would go that far. Horace, oh, you don't want to believe that. You see, I was showing then how far they might go, but I don't really think they go as far as that. And at that point, Lywood, who was group captain, principal deputy director of signals, said, well, here we have the world's expert on propagation. He says the beams are impossible. We ought not to waste any more time on it. I think we ought to cancel the flight. And faced with this, I did, I think, the only thing I could do, which was to say, well, now look, I was at a meeting in the cabinet room this morning, and I heard the Prime Minister give orders for that flight to take place. And if it doesn't take place, I shall see that he gets to know who it was who cancelled it. At that point, Lywood caved in, and so they said, all right, they'll have the flight, although quite clearly, at least some of us didn't expect to find anything. So they said, well, where should we fly?
From operational flying. There is a record, in fact, in the archives at Boscombe Down to show that at least one of the aircraft involved in this project had been recommended for write-off by the engineers. But they were all that could be spared. It was, remember, only 5 days after the Dunkirk evacuation, and everyone was expecting Britain to be invaded by the Germans at any moment. The aircraft had been fitted up with a special American VHF receiver known as Hallicrafters S27. They were designed essentially for radio amateurs, but they were the only receivers available in England at the time that covered the predicted frequency of the beams. And the story goes the RAF officer was dispatched to buy up the whole stock from a radio shop in Soho on credit. The pilot was a Flight Lieutenant Bufton, a skilled beams approach pilot, and the radio operator was a Corporal Mackey of Y Service, a group of skilled operators, most of them pre-war radio hams, who had been formed into this special unit. The name of the navigator isn't known. So, on the night of the 21st of June 1940, if they found any, to try to locate the bearing of the equi-signal in the centre of the beam. So, Flight Lieutenant Bufton climbed away from Witten on a northerly heading in the darkness and the heavy cloud. Behind him, Corporal Mackey, at the receiver, was carefully searching around 31.5 megacycles. And all he could hear was the crash of the static. Then, when they were very close to Spalding, faintly at first, but steadily growing clearer through the noise, the unmistakable sound of a series of Morse dots. And Mackey called out to the pilot, "Skipper, listen to those dots. I think I found the signal." And as they listened, the dots, now very loud, became a constant note, the equi-signal in the middle of the beam. And as they continued on their northerly heading, that equi-signal became a series of dashes. They had, without doubt, found the secret beam.